Are you familiar with the saying, the only thing that is constant is change? Likely you've heard this expression before. Well, it doesn't apply to Jehovah because we know that he's constant and the Bible makes it clear that he doesn't change. But one thing is clear. This past century has given birth to numerous changes. And there has been advances in technology. Perhaps you recall the time when we used to use a rotary dial telephone. Well, now we use smartphones, and sometimes those phones are smarter than we are. And there has been advances in healthcare, education, transportation, and yes, human rights, changes that have benefited many. But on the other hand, not all changes have been for the better. There have been mass killings that have dominated the news, plummeting moral values. Perhaps you can think about the proliferation of the homosexual lifestyles, mounting drug abuse, and more recently, deadly pandemics such as the coronavirus. These changes have had an adverse impact on millions. Consider how the Apostle Paul illustrated these changes long ago by turning with me in your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to focus on verse 31, the B part of the verse. This is the scriptural basis for our theme. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 31 in the B part of the verse. And there it says simply, for the scene of this world is changing. Well, what did the Apostle Paul mean by this expression? Well, the Greek word for scene refers to the present scheme of things. Another word for scheme is plot. Plots are presented in dramas. They're presented in plays. So when Paul used this statement, he may have been alluding to the theater of his day. He may have been comparing the world to a stage where scenes are changing. And the actors on this stage would be the political, the religious, and the cultural icons. Yes, like actors on a stage, they appear. They quickly play their roles, and then they leave the stage to others. Now, in past centuries, it seemed as if these changes were slow. It seemed as if these changes happen over longer periods of time. But this isn't the case today. The course of history can shift in the time it takes for an assassin's bullet to find its mark. Yes, both educators and historians admit that since 1914, the pace of world change has accelerated dramatically. And of course, this comes as no surprise for genuine Christians, since this is the year the world entered its time of the end. In fact, a mental health director for the World Health Organization made this statement, and I'm quoting, "We live in a time of extremely fast changes, which end up causing anxiety and stress at levels never before seen in mankind's history," end quote. Anxiety and stress at levels never before seen in mankind's history. Doesn't that sound like the time period that we find ourselves living in? We're talking about the anxieties that come with just living in these last days, coupled with those that have resulted from this pandemic. But here's the question. Who is the villain in the drama unfolding before us? Well, the Bible provides the answer for us at Revelation chapter 12. Verses 7 through 9. And we're going to also consider verse 12. Please turn there with me. Revelation chapter 12. And let's consider verses 7 through 9 and also verse 12. And war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels battled with the dragon. And the dragon and its angels battled, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them any longer in heaven. So down the great dragon was hurled, the original serpent, the one called Devil and Satan, who is misleading the entire inhabited earth. He was hurled down to the earth, and his angels were hurled down with him. And then verse number 12, on this account, be glad, you heavens, and you who reside in them. Woe for the earth and for the sea, because the devil has come down to you having great anger, knowing that he has a short period of time. So take note that Satan, the devil, is the guilty troublemaker. We see that in verse 9. His ouster from heaven in 1914, as described in verses 7 through 9, has meant woe. That's great distress or trouble. Yes, for the literal earth being ruled by man under his control, as verse 12 shows, but even more so to the symbolic earth, the structure of human society, as well as the symbolic sea, the turbulent mass of mankind itself. So in summary, the villain in the drama is none other than Satan, the devil. He's responsible for the present scene of this world, which is a depressing thing. I'm sure you would agree. Yes, the Bible convicts him. But what do the distressing conditions in the world actually signal? Well, it's shown in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, in a conversation that Jesus had with 4 of his disciples. It signals, 1, the presence of Jesus Christ. Yes, his invisible enthronement as king in 1914. And 2, it signals the fast approaching end of this wicked system of things. In this conversation that Jesus had with 4 of his disciples, he foretold the calamities that will form a sign of the last days and of his presence. That Jesus foretold that there would be wars, that there would be earthquakes, food shortages. And in the parallel account in Luke chapter 21, he foretold that there would be pestilence. Yes, fatal epidemics such as COVID-19, which we're presently experiencing. Like the lines that form a fingerprint, all these events form an unmistakable sign. And just as a fingerprint identifies a person, these events happening at the same time signals the presence of Jesus Christ and the fast approaching end of this wicked system. As a matter of fact, Revelation chapter 6 provides more details. Therein, it describes what has been called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. 3 of these horsemen depict the same disasters that Jesus had earlier foretold. Let's consider these 3 horsemen. Please turn to Revelation and let's look at chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6, and let's start with verse 4. Another came out, a fiery colored horse, and it was granted to the one seated on it to take peace away from the earth, so that they should slaughter one another. And he was given a great sword. So the rider of the fiery colored horse represents warfare. We see that in verse number 4, talking about slaughtering one another with a great sword. Mankind has been fighting wars in one place or another ever since 1914. And sadly, up until our present time, we still see armed conflict between nations or states or different groups within a nation or state. And these wars have killed millions of people. But again, Jesus foretold that we would see such things. Consider verse 5 and 6. When he opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." And I saw and look, a black horse, and the one seated on it had a pair of scales in his hand. I heard what sounded like a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures say, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And do not harm the olive oil and the wine." So the rider of the black horse represents famine. We see that in verse number 6. We see mention made of barley, of olive oil, of wine. Food shortages occur worldwide for a number of reasons. They occur because of war, because of corruption, economic collapse, poor management of agriculture, and more recently, because of global pandemics, such as the one we're experiencing. The World Food Program's 2018 year in review made this statement. It said, across the world, 821 million people are going hungry, 124 million acutely so, end quote. Isn't that disheartening to see so many persons suffering as a result of famine today? And it's been said that 3.1 million children die each year from famine. Yes, Jesus foretold that we would see such things. Look at verse 8. And I saw and look, a pale horse, and the one seated on it had the name Death, and the grave was closely following him. And authority was given them over the fourth part of the earth to kill with a long sword and with food shortage and with, notice, deadly plague and by the wild beasts of the earth. So the rider of the pale horse represents death due to plague and other causes. We see that in verse number 8. In fact, the word pale is fitting since it is used in Greek to describe faces that are blanched as if by disease. Oftentimes we see this portrayed in movies in Hollywood. A World Health Organization publication made this statement. It said, the 21st century has already been marked by major epidemics. Old diseases such as cholera, plague, and yellow fever have returned, and new ones have emerged, such as SARS, pandemic influenza, MERS, Ebola, and Zika, end quote. But what's sad is that even though scientists and doctors have learned much about sicknesses, they have not been able to find a cure for all diseases. Now, and again, why did we consider these three horsemen? It's because Jesus foretold that we would see such things and that it would identify the time period that we find ourselves living in. So what have we considered thus far? Well, thus far, we've considered that the villain in this drama, the one responsible for the woe on the earth, is Satan, the devil. This has been the case ever since his ouster from heaven in 1914. And we've also considered that the distressing world conditions signal that Jesus is present and that these are indeed the last of the last days. Now, how will the final act in this drama play out? Well, Bible prophecy indicates that further significant changes will shortly take place. In fact, the Bible makes it clear why these changes will take many by surprise. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 37 compares the attitude of some today to those who lived during the times of Noah. What was their attitude? Well, they center their lives on normal activities of life, eating, drinking, marrying. And as stated in verse 39, they took no note until it was too late. Yes, until the flood came. So that's one reason why it will take many by surprise. A second reason is going to take many by surprise is simply because they do not believe that God will intervene in human affairs. Well, as spectators, what two scenes should we be on the watch for so as not to be caught off guard? Well, let's identify these two scenes. The first scene can be found for us at 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Let's consider that together. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Now, as for the times and the seasons, brothers, you need nothing to be written to you. For you yourselves know very well that Jehovah's day is coming, exactly as a thief in the night. Verse 3, whenever it is that they are saying peace and security, then sudden destruction is to be instantly on them, just like birth pains on a pregnant woman, and they will by no means escape. So take note that leading up to Jehovah's Day, the nations will issue a significant declaration or announcement of peace and security. That's the first scene that we want to be on the watch for. Now, when we examine verse 3, it shows that this is yet future. How so? Well, it mentions that what will happen after they make this announcement, sudden destruction, which has not yet occurred. And it should be noted too, when we examine these verses, that we do not know what will lead up to this declaration, this announcement. We do not know how it will be made. But whatever happens, we should not be fooled into thinking that world leaders can actually achieve world peace. This wicked system is like a badly shattered mirror. It is beyond repair. It needs to go. It needs to be replaced. I'm sure you would agree with that. Let's consider the second scene that we should be on the watch for so as not to be caught off guard. But before we actually consider the scene, let's first identify the actors in this scene. Please look at Revelation chapter 17. And we're going to examine verse 3. So first, we're going to identify the actors. Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3. And he carried me away in the power of the Spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet-colored wild beast that was full of blasphemous names, and that had 7 heads and 10 horns. So let's identify the actors here. First, we have a woman sitting on the back of the wild beast. This is no literal woman. Now, why do we say so? Well, if you look at verse 1 states that she sits on many waters. Now, what does that mean? Well, look at verse 15. Verse 15 states that the waters means peoples and crowds, nations and tongues. Well, no literal woman could sit on peoples, crowds, nations, and tongues. So as described here, this woman pictures the world's false religions, which Jehovah God rejects. Look at verse 3. Next, we have a scarlet-colored wild beast. This is a symbol of the organization whose purpose is to unite and represent the nations of the world. It first existed as the League of Nations, and now it exists as the United Nations. The woman sitting on the back of the wild beast is noteworthy. Why? It's because it shows that the beast is influenced by religious groups. Now, notice the last 2 words in verse 3, 10 horns. The number 10 is used symbolically in the Bible to represent completeness. A synonym for complete is all. So have that in mind. Now look at verse 12. Verse 12 shows that the horns mean kings or governments. So the 10 horns pictures all present political powers that give their support to the United Nations. So now we've identified the actors. Let's look at the scene that we want to be on the watch for, starting with verse number 15. He said to me, the waters that you saw, where the prostitute is sitting, means peoples and crowds and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns that you saw and the wild beast, these will hate the prostitute and will make her devastated and naked. And they will eat up her flesh and completely burn her with fire. For God put it into their hearts to carry out his thought. Yes, to carry out their one thought by giving their kingdom to the wild beasts until the words of God will have been accomplished. So verse 16 shows that the symbolic wild beasts will destroy religions that falsely claim to represent God. Notice the last statement of verse 16. They will completely burn her with fire. And verse 17 shows that the symbolic beast, or the UN, unwittingly carries out God's thought. So though they will advance their ambition, in reality, they will be doing God's bidding. This attack on false religion, this scene will mark the beginning of the Great Tribulation. Thereafter, the foretold sudden destruction of the political elements, along with all who oppose God's kingdom, will take place. So by way of review, what are the two scenes that we want to watch for? Well, first, in harmony with 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 3, we want to be on the watch for the significant declaration or announcement of peace and security. And in harmony with Revelation chapter 17, verses 15 through 17, the destruction of false religions claiming to represent God, the world empire of false religion. Now, just think of what this means. What might be called the final act is now being played out on the world stage. Soon, Jehovah is going to ring down the curtain on disobedient ones in the war of Armageddon. And this wicked system, with its attitude, its ungodly characteristics, will be completely obliterated. We certainly look forward to that, don't we? And the villain in this drama, yes, Satan, the devil, will get what he deserves. He's going to be bound for 1,000 years, as Revelation chapter 20, verses 1 through 3 shows, and eventually he will be destroyed. This is going to lead to the earth being cleansed. It's going to lead to wonderful changes for all who love Jehovah God. And that's why this is the time for all longing for a righteous new world to examine God's promises. This is the time for us to put faith in Jehovah's inspired word, because God's word, the Bible, reveals that the sequel to this drama will be just as good, if not better. In other words, the best is yet to come. Soon, the scene of this earth is going to change permanently for the good. What we call a promise today will soon be a reality. War, crime, violence, disease, sickness, death, that's going to belong to the past. And all who serve Jehovah God faithfully will have the marvelous opportunity to live as long as Jehovah lives. We can't even begin to fathom that. Would you not agree that the best is yet to come? Well, may each one of us be among those who exercise faith in Jehovah's promises. Dear friends, let's continue to engage in holy acts of conduct and perform deeds of godly devotion. Then we will be privileged to survey the scene when the curtain rises upon an earth-wide paradise.